Before I start, we will record this webinar, so be informed that the recording will be found later, and you accept to be recorded during this webinar. So welcome from my side also. My name is Marja Tiainen, and I work as a senior specialist at the Ministry of the Environment of Finland. And I am the project owner and leading this project from our side. We already have had 2 webinars related to this topic, which were about the LCA databases and data management and BIM-based building LCA. And if you couldn't join those webinars, the recordings and the webinar materials can be found on the website of the Nordic Sustainable Construction, and this recording will be found also there. So here's today's agenda. Morten will go deeply through the agenda, and Morten will also tell about the housekeeping rules before starting his presentation. So how we expect you to interact in this webinar. So I will tell shortly about the overall, or give your overall picture of this whole project. So who is behind the project and what other projects are connected to this one. So Nordic Sustainable Construction is a program under the Nordic Council of Ministers, which contributes to the Nordic Vision 2030 of becoming a sustainable and integrated region by 2030 in respect to sustainable construction and housing. The purpose of the program is to accelerate the knowledge and capacity for green transition in the Nordic construction sector, strengthen Nordic collaboration, and ensure an aligned Nordic path. The program is organized into the following 5 work packages, working with a specific area of sustainable construction. So we have here Nordic harmonization of life cycle assessment, which is, I think, the biggest project in this whole package. Then we have circular business models and procurement, sustainable construction materials and architecture, emission-free construction sites, program secretariat, and competences for reuse in construction. And this webinar belongs to this first one, so the Nordic harmonization of life cycle assessment. In this first work package 1, so the Nordic harmonization of life cycle assessment, we have 4 subtasks. So we have task 1, Nordic LCA practices, which is already completed, and you can find the material from the website of Nordic Sustainable Construction. Then we have the task 2, which is databases and scenarios. Task 3, digitalization of LCA. And then we have this task 4, which is about the limiting values. And in this project, in this Nordic harmonization of life cycle assessment, the aim or the goal is that we work towards harmonizing normative methods for building LCAs in the Nordic countries. Similar approaches will benefit the construction industry and policymakers on national and municipal levels, so that we can support its others' climate ambition in regulation and green public procurement, but also in European policy development, as you have maybe seen that the EBBD is coming and also setting regulation for the LCA calculation and roadmaps for limiting values. But that was my part. Thank you. I give the floor for Morten.
Thank you, Maria. Thanks a lot for this introduction to the overall frameworks and also this project. So if you can share slides, Nicola, then it's brilliant. Yes. So again, this is the agenda for this webinar. Slightly changed a bit, but still it's the same content. So I just changed the wording, but that will be I will give a small introduction to the webinar, the housekeeping rules, and an overview of the project that we'll be talking about today. And then we'll dive into the content, looking at LCA practice, regulations in Nordic countries, key variables for setting limit values, and also recommendations on building stock monitoring in terms of CO2 emissions. And then at the end, we'll save all the good questions and answers to this time. But I will introduce how you can give comments during the webinar and also questions, and then we will answer, say, a few of them, what we have time for at the end of the webinar. So if we move to the next slide, it's front page, and maybe if you just go one back, sorry, I can just say that my name is Morten Røberg. I sit at Sweco Denmark, and it's part of this project in that sense, and I'm here with my colleagues from Nikolai, also from Sweco, Kai, Maria, and Nicola from Build in Aalborg University in Denmark. And then we also have a number of other colleagues that are part of this project that are working in Sweco Norway, Sweco Sweden, and Sweco Finland. And then we also have EFLA from Iceland and LSA support from Estonia. So we are a lot of people joined here today and a lot of competences that are part of this project. We go to the next slide. So the way it works today, the webinar is organized on Teams, but please keep your microphone muted if you're not speaking. That's one of the key rules. It's fine to have camera on or off. We talked a bit about whether there could be some issues with sort of internet connection or bandwidth if too many have cameras on, but so far it seems to work quite well. So please just continue as you are with that. Please do not write comments or questions in the Teams chat, because we will not really pay attention to this, because as soon as you have, let's say, 10 comments or questions, then you start to lose the overview, and we do not really want to forget or overlook important questions and comments. Instead, we would like you to use Slido instead for asking comments or questions, and also for posing comments. There is a Q&A, and you can join Slido either using this QR code with your phone, but you can also join via your browser using going to slido.com, and then there is this code that you need to enter in, and then you will enter the Slido universe, you can say, with the Q&A option, and also we have a number of surveys and polls where we would really like to get your inputs, and you can also answer these here. And last but not least, if you have a specific question or comment and it sort of relates to a specific slide or point in a slide, we really appreciate if you make a reference to this, because then it makes it much easier for us afterwards to figure out, okay, this comment, it relates to slide 5, for instance, and then we can correct that if that's needed, but it just makes our life easier afterwards. Yeah, we'll note down all questions during the webinar, and we will also try to answer as many as possible of the questions you have during the webinar, so you'll get the answers within this webinar. If you go to the next slide. So if you haven't used Slido before, then this is a quick introduction to how it works and what it looks like. So when you log, well, you also have here at the upper right corner, you have the same information. So for logging into a Slido using the QR code or the code via browser. The picture you have on the left, this is if you use your phone. So you can select polls or Q&A, and the polls will be activated continuously. We'll let you know when they are active, so you can fill in this and the Q&A is active now and also for the rest of the day. So if you have a comment after this webinar, you can still put it into the Q&A, and then we will receive this. The image to the right, this is how it looks in the browser. So it is quite similar to using the phone. It's just a different color set, but it works the same way. So maybe let's try and use it. If you go to the next slide, then we have an easy question. So which country are you joining us from? Please try and go into Slido. I can see the first are already in there, so that is brilliant. But try to go in there and answer the survey. And then we'll get back to this in a bit, actually. So if you go to the next slide also. Yeah, just one more. Because then I'll keep the survey active. So that's how it works for surveys. And here I just showed how it looks in the Q&A. So it is very similar. You just have the option to type in your question, and if you want to, then you can also add your name. It's not mandatory. If you don't add it, then it will just say anonymous. But maybe you want to add your name also. That could be. If in Slido and the Q&A, you also have the option to see all the other questions that are posed. And if you just move this one up, I can see. And there you see that you have the option to upload really good questions or comments that you did not write yourself. Moreover, if you press on the browser, there's this like a small person on the upper right corner. If you press this one, then you can go in and then you can only see the comments that you have asked or posted, and then also the answers that will be written to your comments. So you have an overview there. That's really how it works. Yeah, so it should definitely be possible. If you go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So this is for the Q&A. So I will just try to. No, actually I cannot do that. But if you want to try, then you can ask a question, and then it will simply show up. So we have the overview of the most upvoted questions, and also if there are any highlighted questions, then they will pop up first. And this is what we'll use as the basis for the Q&A at the end of the webinar. Good. Okay. Next slide then. And then one more. Yes. So this is as you see, the survey worked. So we can see which countries you are joining us from, and we have one that wants to see the answers. So that's perfect. Here is the answer. But we see that we get a lot from the Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, which is good because this is, of course, particularly relevant for the Nordic countries, but it also has relevance for other countries. So that is great. But this is how it works. I see that it worked. So brilliant, well done. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, and then one more. So this is again on the project. I have another question. So this is what type of organization you are joining us from. This is also open. We have come from consultancy and government. So this is great. Please keep answering this, and then I will talk a bit about the project while you answer the survey also. So if you go to the next slide. Yes. Sorry. So as Maria just said before, this project is part of a larger project on Nordic harmonization of LCA, and we are working with what's called Task 4 on the greenhouse gas limit values and reporting decarbonization of the building stock, so providing recommendations on a harmonized and good process for doing this. And if you go to the next slide, then our project is split into 3 main parts. So the first part is about setting limit values and looking into what are the options and potentials and maybe also barriers for setting limit values, and then based on this recommending an optimal process for doing this. And this is where we, of course, really would like to get your inputs as well on our recommendations. Then we have 4.2, which is the other leg of the project on monitoring the building stock and the decarbonization process using statistics and data that are hopefully available or will be made available. So we will also come up with recommendations on a good process for facilitating this. And then all of this comes together in a final report on monitoring decarbonization of the building stock, where limit values is included as one of the levers for incentivizing decarbonization or facilitating this. So that is the overall overview of the work packages, and we'll dive more into this during the webinar. So if you go to the next slide, just showing the project timeline. So we have been working for about half a year on this now. You can see the first two work packages on limit values and building stock modeling. They are really far and they are close to finalizing. So we have something to inform you about during this webinar, so that is great. And we'll continue that and finalize this. And then the last part of the project is really about preparing the final report, getting everything into place, and there's also a publication process and a review process. But we are expecting that the final report will be launched summer of 24. But there are already a few drafts that you can read now. But please, yeah, that is the expected date when we will launch this. Hopefully just before the summer holiday starts. If you go to the next slide. Yes, so here we have the results of the questionnaire or the survey. So we have a number of majority is consultants. We have a lot from governmental or public institutions. We have quite a lot also from university and academia, and we also have a lot of product producers. So that is interesting. And we also have contractors and developers. So interesting, and I think that's good for us to know also in terms of shaping the content of the final report and being able to tailor the messages and the way it's prepared. So that is great. Thanks a lot for that. Nikolai, if you go to the next slide, then that's all I have on the overall project. So I would like to give the floor to Kai and Maria from Build to talk more about LCA methods and limit values. So floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Morten. So my name is Kai Gnafani. I'm a researcher from Build, and together with my colleague Maria, we will talk about, if you change to the next slide, we will talk about task 4.1A, B and C. So you can use this structure if you're getting lost in the quite complex Nordic projects. If you use the next slide. So we have divided our presentation in 3 parts. I will start giving an overview about our mapping of the current status in Nordic LCA-based building regulation and the potential for harmonization. And Maria is going to present some analysis that we performed in order to support this development. And then I will close off with some recommendations based on both perspectives. So at the beginning, we were doing a kind of mapping that we have closed off. And in general, talking about mapping of the current status means that it's a very dynamic environment. So almost on a daily basis in one of the countries or EU organizations or standardization there, there's an ongoing discussions and new developments. So please, this is a point in time, a snapshot. We try to be as accurate as possible, but feel free to give us an update if you recognize something, especially on the shared reports. So I will start with the current status. Then for the roadmaps, then we go into the national definitions very, very briefly, and I will close off with some more soft preconditions for getting started and having backup for introducing this kind of new regulation. So this is an overview. We don't need to get into all detail, but it gives an impression mostly on the timelines. So this is some of the European countries, obviously the Nordic countries we focus on, and then at the bottom we have Europe. Next. So we are here in start 24. Next. About the European developments, we focus today. We focus on the EPBD, the Building Directive, and there we have 3 milestones in the current proposal, which is the introduction of a roadmap, which is the first arrow in 27, followed by the mandatory declaration for larger buildings, and then in 30, the mandatory declaration for all buildings in EU member states. Next. So, and on this context, we need to understand what's going on in the current countries' efforts, which is kind of a voluntary or preparatory approach before EU standards take effect. And this is also the interesting part where the European development we believe, and so this is, I think, the Nordic ministers' idea behind this is to provide an experimental basis, precedents, and also recommendations for further development, not only in the Nordic countries, but also in other countries having or facing the same challenges and regulatory efforts ahead. So here we can see that the very first draft of national LCA methods for buildings was kind of the basis. Before that, there's of course a history of voluntary schemes in research, and but here this is kind of the starting point where the regulatory apparatus, the machinery took effect and say, okay, let's start the process. Next. And we can see that the first development has been concluded. The second one is introducing a mandatory legal declaration for new buildings, which have been introduced in 3 countries: Denmark, Norway, Sweden. Next. And these boxes indicate the next step, that would be limit values, where we have Denmark having the limit values since January last year, and the planned or proposal of the planned introduction of limit values in other countries. So this progression is kind of has been seen for the current process. Other countries could, of course, or probably don't need to have this progression, and also can use a kind of experiential basis, and maybe jump some of the steps over in order to speed up the process. And we also have to keep in mind that the EU plans are already quite close. So yeah, exactly. So if we go to the next one, now the next slides will be some selected issues of definitory questions and methodological questions, and I try to talk about what are differences and what are similarities, especially differences, which means that there's something to talk about, to discuss, which most definitely also will other countries will face. So we try to share experiences here. So the buildings covered, you can see that the largest body of building types are planned or currently been regulated in most of the countries in the same way. Differences occur in single family homes, which is the first row, where some countries, for different reasons, have not planned or maybe not regulate them in the same way, or maybe have or postponed the regulation of these smaller buildings, because obviously there's a different structure, economic structure, and also technical development, which differs from the professional clients' work. And then we have special building types in terms of industry, especially, but also summer cottages and the like, which are being treated differently. They, of course, occur, make up a very smaller part of the building stock. And then finally, the size of buildings has been approached in this. Some countries have started with larger buildings, but the trend in all countries is the same, that sooner or later all size of buildings will be regulated, and these restrictions to larger buildings is a temporary measure in order to make it feasible to getting regulation started. And finally, renovation projects have been included in some of the countries, and there's an ongoing discussion of how and when to tackle this, because there's a very much a different structure of challenges in these kind of building projects. Next one. Very briefly, the compliance system meaning here is how the authorities, building authorities, are prepared to handle and if there are current plans. And this is very unprecedented, because we just have the first regulations in force right now. So Denmark, Sweden, and Norway have some approaches, but we cannot report from inexperience. So this is you could say the newest development, and also has been probably considered the latest in this journey. Next. Finally, a word on different approaches to limit values. So how to define what carbon limits buildings should comply with. And there are broadly two approaches. In the current regulations, we see the lower one, the bottom-up approach, which is based on a study in one or the other way, a study of the current building stock and their carbon level, and based on that, developing a roadmap of lowering or reducing the current carbon levels. So this would be the bottom-up approach, and the top-down approach would be that we have precedented in some studies today, that if you divide the carbon budget of a country and furthermore a building sector, which you can do from research, then in theory you could provide a limit value for square meter gross floor area based on these absolute levels. For example, in 2030 or 50, and develop limit values from that. In the end, both will be necessary, and it will be interesting to see how this trajectory will develop. But as I said, current actual legislation is based on bottom-up approach. Here we have a couple of selected variables, which also Maria will discuss further. We don't need to look too much into this, but these are the reference unit where the impacts, carbon impacts of a building will be distributed to. Is varying in every country, because it's currently there are different definitions of units. We know that the EU levels at the moment will require the usable floor area, which will require the current regulators to include this definition, either replace the other definition or also include this as a parallel unit in order to prepare for the coming developments. Scenario-based climate data means that since the building life cycle has a future component, then energy or material production might change over time. And for the energy, there's quite a developed approach in most countries, but also on the EU level, which could be used. The same is not the case for material production. So here, one thing is the uncertainty. The other thing is the approach, how to or if to implement this. And this is another variable which is very much it's not really defined on a regional basis. So it would be possible to harmonize a common approach on these both reference units, but also the scenario-based climate data. And maybe we jump to the next one. So if we look at the more soft parameter readiness, which is a part of the background in which in society, how can you introduce new regulation for clients and building actors? And there's so many things that determine when and how deep this regulation can be introduced. And it's about experience, competence, and education on one side, which is connected to, of course, the precedents. Have there been voluntary schemes, which have been the case in most countries? And then finally, there's this more hard or data infrastructure, which covers a lot of different data, and this is what we like to focus on. So if we look at the data infrastructure, then I would just try to introduce that the available data on many different levels is very much dependent on or interdependent on the scope of the regulation and the method that is going to be introduced next. So there's a kind of a flexibility between scope and data infrastructure. So when the scope is very complete, so all life cycle stages and all parts of the building and all processes should be included, then it might be helpful that there's a bunch of generic data, default data, to help getting the whole industry on board. Vice versa, there's another approach where you limit the scope in the first versions of the regulations, which obviously would not require this huge apparatus of generic values. At the moment, there have been different approaches to life cycle completeness, which is also very much dependent on or linked to the inclusion of biogenic carbon or not. We face a full scope European approach at the moment, but there's still very important and meaningful discussions on what is the right method to give because in the end the regulation is about to create the effects on the building, the actual building. That's the purpose. And the other thing would be to give an accurate account of a building life cycle. So this balance, it would be interesting to follow, and I think it's not the last word has not been said. And with the data infrastructure, we mean that on there's different levels. Some countries have proposed that for entire modules, it probably could be possible to use a generic value, for example, for a 4 or 5 in those countries, for example, Denmark, where this is new. But that can also be possible on a lower, a more detailed level, for example, a generic inventory data for materials and for product service life, instead of allowing a bunch of different definitions. There's an advantage to harmonize this approach. And then with the approach, which is the case in all countries except Norway, to provide a generic product database. So this is the kind of almost classic generic data approach. But this is to show that there are other parts of the method value chain, so to speak, where generic data could be considered in order to ease and to make the regulation, the introduction more feasible. Next. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I give the word to Marie.
Yeah, so thank you, Kai. So now that Kai has given you like a nice and brief overview of the differences in the Nordic countries' regulations, I will present some first observations we have made in relation to what is the influence of the most relevant variables for the limit values. Next. Yeah. So to understand which variables can actually have a great influence, we first look at the existing limit value reports we have in several of the Nordic countries, and this gave us a good first indication of what is particularly relevant and important to further explore. And at the same time, when we needed to get some additional insights, we used two generic case models and we performed parameter analysis in a way that we altered some parameters and see what is the effect and the importance of different variables. Next. So you can see here, like in this table, which parameters we analyzed based on synthesizing existing knowledge and sometimes also performing our own illustrative calculations. And the parameters have to do, for example, with the building stock data, which form the basis for creating the limit values with scope and method related variables. For example, what would it mean to exclude some parts of the building life cycle or some parts of the building model itself for the limit value. And then we also have the climate data. So most of the countries use at the moment generic data to calculate their building cases and derive the limit value. So the differences in the data could also kind of create differences in the limit values among countries. And then another important question is like what kind of building design choices could perhaps become more unfeasible as we tighten the limit values, as we need to kind of create already a downwards projection of the limit values. And then at the same time, we have some variables we examine that have to do with how the limit values will evolve. So what kind of influence some variables can have, like the future technology in the material production, processing, and so on. So next slide. Yes, so one of the first steps in developing limit values is to create a building cases database. And to create such a database, there are two broad approaches in a way. So we can have like a sample of real buildings, or we can create archetypes. And both approaches have strengths and weaknesses, but we see them as complementary. For example, the main strengths of using real buildings is that we have a better representation of the reality and low probability to have like a systematic error, as our base is specific real cases. Also, another advantage is that after introducing mandatory declarations and having a good data management infrastructure to collect the results of the declarations, we can have like a complete sample of the new building stock and let's say perform as is detailed as is analysis of the building stock. At the same time, the weakness of having, let's say, a sample of real buildings is that we cannot control the different parameters that easily to see also the cause and effect situation. So what kind of changes have actually caused the decarbonization. And in this sense, we can use archetypes where we can have a very good control of the parameters, and we can kind of develop scenarios of how the future building stock can actually be decarbonized. So I think it's good to eventually use both approaches to develop limit values. Next slide. So having sufficient building cases in place, the next question that comes into play is usually what scope to consider for the limit values. So what is what is relevant, reasonable, and feasible, and at least for the first generation of the limit values. What we noticed by looking at the differences among the Nordic countries is that location and site sensitive aspects tend to not be included in the limit values, or not fully at least, like deep foundations and soil stabilization, basement parking, external works, or even construction site processes. And the way we interpret this is that such aspects, although of potentially very high importance, and you can see here on this slide some examples of studies of what is, let's say, the maximum contribution we have identified of these parameters in the different Nordic studies. So although these aspects can be of very high importance, they may interfere with other types of regulation, like zoning and urban planning regulations, which define where one is allowed to build or where we have available parking. So in some countries, it is discussed whether these aspects should actually be assessed and regulated separately of the building itself, if assessed at all. So this is a kind of an important question to ask for the Nordic countries from our perspective. Next slide. So in relation to other often missing building parts and modules from the limit value scopes at the moment in the Nordic countries, one immediate observation is that excluding replacements before from the scope, which is the case for some countries, undermines the relevance of building items which typically have short service lives, like building services, fixed furniture, internal finishes. And you can see here like the importance of the before based on some standard values existing in the different Nordic countries at the moment in these graphs. Yeah, and you can see that building services are actually quite relevant to include them in the scope, and Norway does not do this at the moment. And by including them, we can also encourage building service industry to provide more and better data, because there is some sort of lack of data for building services, and also optimize their products. At the same time, B1, like the refrigerant leakage, is also a big part of the total impact of some of the building services, like heat pumps and cooling systems. And this aspect is at the moment neglected in the Nordic limit values and regulation. So moving on to the next slide, the next topic, some other method-related aspects beyond the scope. So you can see here, so as Kai mentioned, we use at the moment difference area units in the Nordic regulations. And we here kind of give an example of what is the impact of these differences in the reference area unit definitions, where we calculate like an apartment building with the same scope and data, but varying the units to fit the various definitions. And you can see that the differences are significant. And this particular building case includes an unheated basement, which, for example, increases a lot the Finland's and Estonia's result, because they are using the heated floor area definition, and the same applies to the balconies, which increase even further the result of Finland and Estonia and the levels result. Also, we want to stress out here that it is important to also start thinking to normalize results using complementary metrics like per resident or building user, in order to be able to account for how efficiently the space is used. So with the current reference units we use, which are area-based, we do not regulate actually the amount of square meters we build. And this could perhaps be important if we want to achieve our overall decarbonization goals eventually. So let's move to the next topic. Yeah, another methodological aspect which will be important in future is that in at least in some of the Nordic countries currently it is discussed how to approach future scenarios for the scenario-based part of the life cycle of the building, being the used states and the end-of-life states. So we already do this for B6 in the Nordic countries, the ones which include B6. And there are now many debates of whether we should actually include decarbonization scenarios also for B4, B2, and C modules. And in a way also give a greater focus on upfront climate impacts from materials. And of course, we also have like the friends approach, who are kind of using simplified discount factors, but we can also follow a more detailed approach where we use like specific projections for material production processes for different material types. So I will not explain the numbers here because it's just an example, an illustrative example of the importance of switching from a more static approach to a more dynamic approach, also for the use states modules of the embodied part. And maybe it's important to note that task 2 from the Nordic LCA harmonization project will also planning to provide recommendations on how to actually integrate future scenarios into the data and so on. So the project as a whole may come out with some recommendation on how to properly do this if we decide the Nordic countries to go in this direction. So next slide. So showing some differences in the climate generic data used in the different countries. So of course, variations in the results and limit values are normal when we calculate the same building, for example, with the different Nordic methods and scopes. But then you can see how this looks like in the first graph. But then when we limit the comparison in the same scope, for example, A1 to 3, and the same building parts, the same indicator, which means that we exclude the biogenic carbon from Denmark. And then, so we have the same basis for comparison. We still see some notable differences in the result. And this comes from the variations in some values used for similar products in the national generic databases, at least in Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. These variations reflect the differences in conservative factors the countries are using, the background data, but also some actual differences in the products themselves. And you can see some examples of the differences in the values for some product, for some specific products on the right-hand side. So next slide. Yeah. So when it comes to building design, it is important to understand how various building properties affect the LCA results, and also to reflect on whether and how a future tightening of the limit values might constrain specific building design choices. So we have here an illustrative calculation of a generic apartment building covering only the embodied impacts, and we have variated some selected design aspects, such as the type of structural material or facade material, the amount of internal walls, the inclusion of basement or balconies, and so on. And we have come out with various different design combinations, as you can see here, like this long list of results. So we can gain main insights from such an exercise and parametric analysis. Some noteworthy observations are that, for example, including a basement actually lowers the carbon footprint of the building, specific building design solutions. But when in the cases with low emissions, this trend reverses. Another observation is that if we start like significantly tightening our limit value, next we can, for example, if we go like to 7 kilograms CO2 equivalent per square meter per year, or even lower. So next. So yes, you can see that we start seeing some constraints in our design choices. For example, we probably need to shift to more bio-based materials when it comes to structural materials and even facades. So, of course, this apartment building here was calculated with generic data, and perhaps these restrictions could be mitigated if we would choose products with a better environmental performance, like product-specific EPDs for this study. So next slide. Yeah, another important aspect we want to stress is that when we decide on the limit values levels, it's important also to kind of give some first idea of how this limit value will progress in future. And it's always a question how much we can tighten the limit values in future, how low we can go. And here you can see that it's important to kind of distinguish between what reductions can be achieved without any great intervention by building actors, and what reductions can only be achieved by applied actual changes in the way we build. So the design itself, the energy performance, or the construction processes. So the first category of reduction potentials can be, for example, the phasing out of generic data and use of product-specific data, which automatically lowers the level of the limit value. Also choose better products within a certain category of product. Better products which are available already today and can be like the common practice of the future. Or we also need to kind of also include the consideration of how the materials will gradually decarbonize the processes, the production processes. So this is kind of where the baseline for the future should be drawn, below which the future limit value should be decided upon if we want to be ambitious and then to, in a way, push the building industry towards optimizing design and choosing low impact materials, and not just reflect the reductions that may happen automatically anyway. Next slide. So you can see here like a kind of a simple exercise of trying to understand, for example, what would it mean for a typical Danish single-family house to see the progression of the embodied GDP level, which can occur without much effort. For example, what we have done here is we have kind of considered data distributions for different material types, and the data distributions were generated based on the Danish EPD data, and we integrated these probabilistic, let's say, emission factors in the calculations of the typical single-family house. And then we get like a range of for the result, as you can see, like the blue box plot. So if we arbitrarily assume that today's, for example, best available technology within the same product category, so without switching to another alternative product, is represented by the 25th percentile of this range, which can also be a kind of somewhat conservative consideration, then we can have automatically a 12% reduction without any effort. This kind of corresponds to more than 1 kilogram CO2 equivalent per square meter per year. Then adding the decarbonization efforts in the material supply chain, which are represented with some of the colored lines here, you can see that we can achieve reductions of the magnitude of between 0.5 to 1.7 kilogram CO2 equivalent per square meter per year. Again, without the building actors actually doing any great effort. So this is kind of the range within which the baseline for the future limit values should be drawn, so that we start investigating what is the further reduction based on the changes we want to see in the design can go. So what is the potential? So next slide. So I will only say a few words for task 4.1D because we kind of just started looking into it. Next slide. So, I mean, we talked about the possibilities, what are like, how to kind of, what kind of investigations we need to have in order to understand how much we should tighten the limit value. But in doing so, we also need to consider the broader expected changes stricter limit values may bring. For example, in the technical requirements for buildings, in the way we build, in the way construction products will change, and also the wider economy, environment, and society. And we are planning to analyze these expected or even required changes driven by different limit values scenarios according to an actor and levels matrix, as you see here in the illustration. So this is kind of the next step for us in the coming weeks. And without further ado, I would like to give, in a way, the floor to you in the sense that we have prepared some questions in Slido. Yes. So now we want to know your point of view when it comes to what variables do you think are suited to be harmonized across regions. So this is kind of a multiple choice question. And if you feel that we don't cover some of the aspects, you can always write in the Q&A or elaborate further on your answers. So I think we should give a few seconds here for the participants to answer. So let's see. Yes. So we all agree on the building parts included. Yeah. And we have also a second question for you. The polls will be open, yes? Morten, I think, yeah.
We will also activate them again, right?
Yeah, so we will activate them again. Then also we have like a second question for you. What location sensitive variables should be out of scope for the initial limit value if you believe that any of them should be out of scope and should be assessed, for example, separately? So you can also start answering here.
Slider.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, interesting. So we have a certain trend. It's nice. Okay, so I think we can move to the recommendations. Please continue replying to the questioners. You can do it. And yes, now we will continue with Tali again.
So in a way, this is the answer to. So this was our considerations regarding what kind of variables can be harmonized, what should be harmonized. This is still under development, as you can see. There's some gaps also. I will pick a few because time is running and we need to look at databases as well. But if you take some time looking at this later, the structure is that you have the variables and which have been treated by Maria and the first part of the presentation. Then you have recommendations, and on the harmonization column, there is the potential or ongoing process of harmonization. Maybe we can from this slide we can look at the generic data. We believe that the exact use of generic data is very much dependent, of course, on the scope and the readiness of the building industry. So as I said before, generic data can be very useful to speed up the implementation process, and that might be individual in each country. But the structure and the method behind developing and using generic data, and there's a great potential for harmonizing it, because these levels are fixed and not all of them have to be used, but the approach could be harmonized. And the same goes for the building model, which this is also both a kind of a part of the scope, so how many building parts or processes are included, but on the other hand, this is also a part of the data structure. And we know that classification in construction is very differently. It is also being treated in task 2 of this wider project outside our project group. But here, this is also very much dependent on, and it would ease also cross-national actors like consultants or construction companies and manufacturers to provide the same services in all countries. Next. Maybe we take the carbon limit differentiation, but this is meant, okay, how many carbon levels do you need? There's the one approach, like in Denmark, where you have one limit value currently for all kinds of buildings, and for example in France, where you have a lot of differentiated carbon values depending on a lot of parameters like region and climate and other aspects. So this could be very much harmonized in the sense that where are the local, what is the reason for using different carbon limits? Because the idea must be to put some pressure and incentives on reducing the limits. But the structure of how many and for how many different types of buildings, that could be a common approach. Next one. Yes. The reference area, as I said, is very different. But this might not be realistic to have a harmonization of this. Instead, the introduction of a new harmonized area could be the way out, kind of starting fresh all over, using the usable area. But before doing this, it is vital to harmonize the approach to this, so we don't end up in another regime where we all use different approaches to usable floor area. Yes, that was my words. Thank you.
I think that was it for Maria and Kai, and now I will take over. My name is Nikolaj. I work here at Sweco in Denmark, in Copenhagen, as a sustainability engineer, and I've been leading this second part of task 4 on monitoring the decarbonization of the building stock. And just to continue with this diagram, so that you know where in the project that we are, what part of the project we're talking about. We're in this task 4.2, monitoring the decarbonization of the building stock. And I will start out with talking a little bit about, mainly talking about actually 4.1b, as we call it, which is where we recommend a process for the monitoring of the decarbonization. And then I will just talk a little bit about what we call 4.1a and 4.1c, which is an outline of the policies and strategies in the different countries for decarbonization. And in the last part, we have some recommendation for what parameters to build in when we're forecasting and modeling future scenarios. And what you could say is that we are kind of already monitoring carbon from different industries with these national environmental accounts. I will also talk a little bit about this later. And some countries also have develop more sophisticated versions of these national accounts. Our interpretation of this task here is to give recommendations on how to follow the effect of introducing limit values, and also how to monitor cause, not only effect. So going on to the next one here, we've done quite a big examining of scientific papers describing environmental building stock modeling. And what we found was that, well, generally speaking, environmental building stock modeling can be put into these 4 categories. So there is product life cycle, energy analysis, material flow analysis, and then there's this category called financial flow, which is the one that the national accounts is built on. I will talk a little bit more about this in a minute. But what we see is that so all of the whole subject that Maria and Kai just presented, so the national climate declarations and the limit values are based on the first one, so product life cycle method. And I mean, if the operation is included, we of course also have this energy analysis or energy simulation. So that's like the 2 first categories that are represented here. And yeah, as I just said, we also have these national accounts, which are these also these so the national strategic goals, the 70% reductions and 50% reductions and so on. That's what these are based on. And I think we will just start with an activity, and then you are able to vote during this my entire presentation here. So I will just open it, and then I will go on, because we're also a little bit tight on the time. So which environmental building stock modeling approach do you see best fit for assessing the decarbonization efforts? So jumping on to the next one here, we have identified 3 different modeling techniques that we found applicable. So the first one, and the first 2 ones that I'm going to mention, is also the ones that Kai and Maria mentioned. So the archetype modeling with LCA and energy simulations. So archetypes with emission factors are defined. Monitoring on building stock level could be achieved by utilizing data on added square meters per archetype. And then we have this sample approach, where we sample all the climate declarations and get an overview of the whole building stock in that sense. And then we have this last one, which is this financial modeling, which is basically you could say already happening in some different ways. We know that Sweden, for example, has developed a more detailed way in calculating this, or a more sophisticated way. But they are all based on environmental input-output analysis. So, I mean, the main differences here is that 2 of them uses this bottom-up method and is based on this product lifecycle modeling technique, and the financial modeling, which is typically this environmental input-output model, is based on financial flow analysis and is more a top-down approach. The 2 bottom-up modeling techniques for monitoring is still to be established, as you could also hear on Kai and Maria's presentation. There is still some work needed to be done here before we have what we can say a monitoring that we can just apply right away. So one of the other main differences that we identified here is the possibility to investigate both cause and effect, which was at least our goal here in our recommendation. So with the 2 bottom-up approaches, we see that it is possible to investigate cause and effect of emissions on building level, and also inform impacts on these regulatory limit values that have been presented. And with the financial modeling, we are kind of restricted to investigating effect on a macro level. So just jumping a little bit into these financial flow modeling or environmental input-output analysis. We're not gonna go too deep into that, but yeah, it's a powerful tool that has many applications in environmental economics and helps to understand the environmental impact of economic activities, identify the sectors most affected by environmental policies, calculate footprints for on a macro level for countries, cities, and so on. But there are also some implications with using these input-output. So what we see is that it's not really comparable to these CO2 limit values that we set in the national regulations, which are based on process LCA. We also see, at least for that, there could be what we call an affordability bias. So if the models are not calibrated with the correct emission data, they might not take into account that more environmental friendly option could be more expensive, which means that higher economic spend could mean higher environmental impact, which not always is the case. And then, of course, this problem that we've also, I also talked a little bit about before, that we identified that we couldn't really look into causes on a building level, only effect on macro level. So that's kind of why we recommend using one of the other types, which we will also go into now. Okay, yeah, so this was just our strengths and weaknesses with these two, always with this model. So what we did was we mapped out the existing building information database landscape in the Nordic countries, and I'm not going to go too deep into this. You will be able to read this in the report that we actually sent out to you after this webinar. But this was to identify the possibilities of utilizing the existing data for environmental building stock monitoring. So for each country, we gathered in all the databases that existed on building information. So we created this inventory that summarizes the databases and information sources that were available in each Nordic country. So back to these, now that we've kind of ruled out the financial modeling, at least for this particular task here, of course, the financial models are still a very powerful tool. We know that for the national goals and so on. But for this particular recommendations, where we also want to look at cause and effect, and where we also want to harmonize with how we set the limit values, we recommend going with either the archetype modeling or the sampling approach, as we call it. And I mean, what we see is that with archetype and sampling, it gives us the possibility to looking deeper into the causes of the emissions on a building level. That is at least, of course, if the data and the structure of the data is good enough. And what we could see from our database landscape mapping that you will be able to read in the report is that creating this monitoring approach based on samples is not possible yet. So with the currently, at least not with the currently recorded data in the Nordic countries. And that is why the first recommendation would be to create an archetype approach in the Nordic countries, where we construct a monitoring model for each Nordic country here. And what I said with that it's not possible yet, it's not actually entirely true. That's also, I think you saw this in a previous slide, that Sweden have actually introduced a digital infrastructure to record this data coming in from the climate declaration. So it is coming. But yes, okay, so our first recommendation here is to look into archetype modeling. And the current data landscape allows for establishing archetype models. That's what we could see. There are still some next steps here that needs to be done before we can actually start monitoring. And that is, of course, defining these archetypes. We would recommend that they would be based on these archetypes that are represented in the building register databases. Then we would, of course, also need to define emission factors for these archetypes. We know that there is some work already done in some countries defining these archetypes and defining emission factors. So it would be good to work further on the backbone of that research. And then, of course, I mean, with all new processes, there would be we would have to define a process for updating emission factors and yeah, a good process for operating the database and so on. But we found this approach suitable for developing building stock scenarios and these top-down target-based limit values, as Kai and Maria presented. And what we can see here, a good thing is that we can have a smaller representative sample could be used for monitoring the entire building stock. What we can see as potential issues here is that there could be a risk of systematic errors. Representativity, it of course depends on the data input, and of course that the database infrastructure is not really established yet. So what we found from our research in these Nordic building information databases is that the available attributes right now that is being recorded could be the building type, so building typology. This is what we could build our archetypes from. And then we also record area. So we record area in all Nordic countries for each building type. And this is also how we recommend to aggregate it to a building stock level. So how we could monitor carbon emissions on a building stock level. Yes, just jumping to the next one here. Then we, if the archetype modeling approach is to be introduced and used, we recommend defining same building types, but using national carbon emission calculations. That's also what you saw from Kai and Maria's presentation, that even though we take out all the variables, for example, biogenic carbon and so on, and we compare results, we still see that generic data varies in each country. So by having the same archetypes defined, the data can be aggregated to a Nordic level, a Nordic monitoring level. So our next recommendation here is this, so going back to this sampling approach, which we actually really believe in. So we believe that the introduction of these climate declarations in the Nordic countries and also the EPBD, which states that GVP should be disclosed through the energy performance certificate anyways. We believe that this will really qualify this sampling approach as, you could say, the best option for monitoring the entire building stock. We believe that if we build a good database infrastructure, it would be possible to gather environmental impact data on building level, but also on aggregated levels. And this would make it possible to pull the relevant data and to monitor comparable data in the Nordic countries. Yes. So, yeah, as we defined in our investigation in 4.1, so just a little bit of positives and negatives with this recommendation here. So the positive is here that with the mandatory climate declarations, we found this really suitable as a really suitable approach for as-is analysis of the building stock. And with a complete sample, the suitability for developing limit values is also very high. The potential issues here could, of course, be that we would need a large, or at least a complete, or at least a very large sample of buildings from the building stocks for validity. And also, as we mentioned before here, we can say that the database infrastructure doesn't really exist yet, so we would have to establish that. So this is one of our main recommendations. We really strongly believe that building a good database infrastructure to gather up on the information that we get from the climate declarations is a strong approach. And we could say that you could get inspiration from the Swedish method already. And our recommendation here also goes quite well hand in hand with, at least with the latest recommendations from this report from the Danish industry, which is Denmark's largest business and employer organization, which they have this action-oriented think tank for the building industry. And here they state that to ensure uniformity in the reporting of LCA results, we need to establish a standardized reporting format, and LCA results should also be collected in a database to ensure that knowledge of buildings footprint can easily be shared. So we are going very well hand in hand with this. Just shortly on if we had to include this energy use operation, we could either include the predicted data from the modules B6, which is also have been mentioned, which are being reported in some of the climate declarations, but we could actually also include a data source on actual use data. And here we recommend following the method used by the EU Building Stock Observatory that was established back in 2016, where they keep track on the EU building stock as energy performance. So just a quick note, I see that we're running a bit out of time here on task 4.1a and C. So in task 4a, we mapped out these Nordic countries' national climate goals. So we mapped out the national carbon neutrality goal, the carbon reductions compared to 1990 level goals, and the renewable energy goals. And you will be able to jump more into this when you read the report here, but we've mapped it out. And in the last part of this 4.2, we've reviewed 4 different initiatives, research papers, which all includes elements for forecasting and scenario modeling. What we found was that we could put them into what we defined as 3 different categories. So one category that impacts emission factors, one that impacts building stock, and one that impacts building design. And again, we don't have the time to present this in very much detail, but here you see the 4 different initiatives we looked into. So 2 different scientific papers, and then the IEEA's pathway and UK GBC's whole life carbon roadmap. And just a quick comment here, we found that these were the findings from the forecasting and future scenario modeling. And just a quick note here, as I also have been teasing a little bit about, we will have a draft report for 4.2. So monitoring the decarbonization of the building stock will be published after this webinar for you guys to comment. And I think we set the deadline for 15th of February, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. So that was it for me. And now we have 2 minutes left here.
Yes, no, but thanks a lot, Nikolai, and that's great. Yeah, we have 2 minutes just before we go into that. So these are the key questions that are there so far, and really thanks a lot for everyone that are questioning and commenting what we have. That's great. As I said before, it will be kept open. So if you have questions afterwards, please post them, and I think we will also answer these questions, because we cannot answer all questions during this 1.5 hour. Unfortunately, we are not that fast. But you know, with the last minute, I think we can maybe look into 2 top questions, and then we'll answer the rest also in the Q&A, so you can see it. But I think it's a very good comment from that the first one about having not multiple databases. It really relates to data. And having like a common database across the Nordic countries, I think that is a very good idea. My understanding is also that this is what is sort of in the process. At least there is harmonization work going on between the Nordic countries, and to ensure that EPDs are to the extent possible comparable across different Nordic countries. So I think having a common Nordic database is the next step. And I know at least in Norway and Denmark, you can have your EPD included as part of their database. So if you have a Danish EPD, you can have it included as part of the Norwegian database. So I think this process is ongoing. It is, of course, maybe not as fast as we would like. I think the next one is also very much on data. So I think I would like to raise this one about module A and biogenic carbon and bio-based materials, because of course that's a big issue, and I think do one of you have a good point? Nicola, yes, please.
Yes, I'm a little bit familiar with this because I worked with that in Sweden before. So specifically for the Swedish method, where only module A was covered in the beginning, they use an accounting method for biogenic carbon, where biogenic carbon is already net zero in module A instead of being negative in module A and positive in module C. So you don't end up with these negative values. So it's an accounting convention.
Yeah, exactly. So that's how it is. But of course, when we talk about harmonizing LCA and limit values, if we're looking across the Nordic countries, then of course how to treat biogenic carbon becomes really important, and it also includes the scope of the LCA. Is module C included or not? All of this, of course, that's something we're also dealing with and talking about. Yeah. So because as Nikolai said, we're running out of time, so that's good. We are effective and spending all the time. But again, just thanks a lot for all the questions. We'll try to answer all of them during today, so you have an answer to your question. So if you go to the next slide, just for me to wrap up, and sorry about the coughing. So this is the webinar we had today, and then we'll take all the notes and all the good comments that you have, and you have already received one of the draft reports where we would really appreciate getting your comments on this to improve the quality of the report, and if there's something we have forgotten, then we can add this still before finalizing and making the final report. We plan to launch this, I think week 26 we talked about. That was our aim, so around that time, so you can already now book time in your calendar for reading the report, and then we'll have a bigger launch at a different after the summer, I think. Next slide. Just to really finalize, as I said, you already have the first draft report. We would really appreciate your comments by February 2nd, because we need to close that report for commenting also to get it out and live. Please send comments to this email. You will also receive the slides after the webinar, so you can see the email, which is not necessarily the easiest address. There is a second draft report on decarbonization of the building stock that will provide details on most of the things that Nikolai presented. As Nikolai said, we would like to get feedback on this on the 15th, the latest, and there's also an email for this. And again, you'll get the slides so you can see what is the mail. But this will also be linked to the website for the webinar here, so you can find the drafts there, and you can also find the email to provide comments and inputs. Yes, next slide. So that's all we have for today. Thanks a lot for your time. Sorry for spending 4 minutes or 5 minutes too much. We really appreciate all the good comments, and I hope you found this interesting. And from our team, we just want to say, yeah, thanks a lot, and have a great day and a nice weekend when you get there also.